Imagine you're 17 years old, standing in an open cow pasture, in the frozen dark before dawn. January 17th, 1781. You've never fired a musket at another human being. The general commanding this line, a man most of you have served under for less than a week, has just given an order. That makes no sense. Fire 2 shots at the approaching redcoats, then turn around and run. Not fight to the last man, run. On purpose. Somewhere out past the tree line, 700 of the king's most feared soldiers are marching straight at you, led by a 26-year-old colonel already infamous across the Carolinas for a battle where his men reportedly kept cutting down Continentals after they'd thrown down their arms. Men don't ask this colonel for quarter anymore. They just run and hope, and the general who just told you to retreat before the fighting even starts is Daniel Morgan. How does a battlefield commander win by ordering his own men to break and run? And how does the most feared cavalry officer in British America walk face first into a trap a nervous farm boy could see coming? The answer is one of the most complete tactical destructions of the entire American Revolution, and it took less time than it takes to read the sentence twice. By January of 1781, the revolution had shifted south, and the South was losing. 5 months earlier at Camden, a British force under Lord Cornwallis had annihilated an American army nearly twice its size. Continental regulars broke, militia fled without firing a shot, and the man who commanded them, General Horatio Gates, reportedly didn't stop riding until he was 60 miles from the battlefield. The Continental Congress needed a new strategy in the Carolinas, and fast. Command passed to Nathaniel Greene. And Greene made an unconventional call, split his already outnumbered army in 2. He sent a detachment of roughly 600 men, Continental Infantry, Virginia Riflemen, and Lieutenant Colonel William Washington's Dragoons under Daniel Morgan into the South Carolina backcountry. Their job, threaten the British outpost at 96, gather local militia, and generally make Cornwallis's life difficult without risking a decisive battle. Cornwallis didn't like an independent American force, loose behind his lines. He split his own army in response and handed the pursuit to the one officer he trusted to run Morgan down fast, Banastre, Tarleton. Daniel Morgan was 51 years old at Cowpens, and by every physical measure, he shouldn't have been there at all. Chronic sciatica had gotten so severe by early 1781 that he could barely mount a horse some mornings, and he'd already tried to resign from the army once in 1779 out of frustration at being passed over for promotion. He came back anyway when the British pushed south. Before he was a general, Morgan had been a teamster hauling supply wagons through the Virginia backcountry as a teenager, and as he told it later in life, he'd once struck a British officer during the French and Indian War and been sentenced to 500 lashes for it. He liked to joke that the drummer keeping count had lost his place, so he only actually took 499. True or embellished, Morgan carried the scars on his back for the rest of his life, and he never forgot what it felt like to serve under men who didn't respect the soldiers beneath them. It shaped how he commanded. He'd led the desperate assault on Quebec in 1775 and been captured. He'd led his riflemen at Saratoga in 1777 and helped break a British army for the first time in the war. Now he was doing it again, in a cow pasture, with men who'd never fought together before. Tarleton was the opposite in almost every way. 26 years old, wealthy, a former law student who'd gambled away most of his inheritance before buying a cavalry commission and discovering he had a genuine talent for war. He commanded the British Legion, a mixed force of cavalry and light infantry recruited largely from American loyalists. And he'd built a reputation on speed, forced marches, surprise attacks, hitting rebel forces before they had time to prepare. 8 months earlier at the Waxhaws, his cavalry had caught a Continental detachment trying to surrender and cut them down anyway, at least according to American accounts that spread through the Carolinas like wildfire. Whether Tarleton personally ordered it or simply lost control of men who thought their colonel had been shot, the reputation stuck for the rest of the war. Militiamen started calling it Tarleton's quarter, meaning no quarter at all. It made men afraid of him. It also, as Morgan was about to prove, made Tarleton dangerously predictable. He attacked, always, immediately, aggressively, without waiting to see the whole board. By mid-January, Morgan was in trouble. Tarleton was closing fast, and Morgan's small army was retreating toward the broad river with nowhere obvious to make a stand. Cross the river, and he'd be trapped against the bank if Tarleton caught him mid-crossing. Keep retreating, and his militia, volunteer farmers who could walk home any time they chose, would simply melt away rather than face Tarleton's dragoons in open country. Morgan needed to fight, and he needed to fight now. On ground of his own choosing, he chose the worst ground, a textbook general would have picked, an open, gently rolling pasture called Hannah's Cowpens, used by local farmers to graze cattle before driving them to market. No hills to anchor a flank, no swamp or forest to break up a cavalry charge. And directly behind his position, the broad river, still running too high to cross safely. Any conventional officer would have called it suicide, a battlefield with no natural cover and no escape route. Morgan wanted exactly that. He understood something about his own army that no map could show. His militia's greatest weakness wasn't cowardice. It was the temptation to run at the first sign of danger, because running was always an option. Take that option away, put a swollen river at their backs, and you changed the psychology of every man in the ranks. There was nowhere left to flee to. There was only forward or death. So instead of fighting the instinct to run, Morgan built his entire battle plan around it. He arranged his army in 3 lines. First, roughly 150 of his best marksmen, hand-picked riflemen and skirmishers, spread out well in front of the main position, with orders to pick off officers and cavalry at range, then fall back. Second, a militia line of about 300 men under Andrew Pickens, with an order that would become the most famous instruction of the battle. Fire 2 aimed volleys at the approaching British, and only 2 then withdraw around the American left flank to reform in the rear. Not a rout, a choreographed retreat, planned in advance, down to the number of shots. Behind them, his third line, roughly 400 to 500 Continental regulars and experienced militia under Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard, the anchor of the whole formation. And held out of sight behind a small rise, William Washington's cavalry, Morgan's reserve, his hammer, waiting for the moment the British committed themselves fully. Every man on that field, from the front skirmish line to the rear guard, knew exactly what he was supposed to do and in what order. Morgan walked the lines that night and the next morning personally, talking to militia companies by name, telling them plainly, 2 shots, then fall back, and nobody will call you a coward for it, because it's the plan. Tarleton, meanwhile, was making the mistake Morgan was counting on. Learning Morgan's position from scouts, he decided to force march his men through the night to catch the Americans before they could cross the broad river. He woke his force at roughly 2 or 3 in the morning, pushed them through freezing mud and swollen creek crossings for hours, and arrived at Cowpens near dawn with soldiers who hadn't eaten and had barely slept. Tarleton had beaten every American force he'd faced so far through sheer relentlessness. He saw no reason to stop now, rest his men, scout the ground properly, or wait for full daylight. He formed his exhausted, hungry column into line of battle and ordered an immediate attack. Infantry in the center, dragoons on the flanks, his reserve of Highlanders and cavalry held back to finish whatever the first assault didn't. He was about to walk directly into the trap. Morgan had spent all night building for him. If you want to see how history's most brilliant and brutal minds changed the world, make sure you're subscribed to Kingdom Keys. The story continues right after this. Dawn broke cold and gray over Cowpens on January 17, 1781. Tarleton's column came on fast, dragoons in front, infantry advancing in tight formation behind them, everyone moving on adrenaline and momentum rather than rest. Morgan's skirmish line opened first. From nearly 150 yards, long range for a musket but well within reach for a trained rifleman, American sharpshooters began picking off targets with deliberate, unhurried aim. They weren't shooting at the massive infantry, they were shooting at officers, at cavalry, at anyone wearing markings of rank. Within minutes, roughly 15 British dragoons and officers had been hit before the main lines had even closed. Then, exactly as ordered, the skirmishers fell back through gaps in the militia line to reload and rejoin the fight from behind. Next came Pickens' militia, the line everyone, including the British, expected to break and scatter the moment real fighting started. They didn't run early. They stood, took aim, and delivered one volley, then a second. At close range into a formed British line, 2 aimed volleys from 300 muskets is devastating. Men went down along the entire British front. And then, precisely as Morgan had instructed the night before, the militia turned and withdrew around the American left flank, moving with more order than panic, heading for the rear to reload and reform. To Tarleton, watching from horseback, it looked like exactly what he'd seen a dozen times before. The militia line, supposedly the weak link in every American army, had fired a couple of ragged volleys and broken for the rear. In his experience, that was the moment a battle turned into a rout. He didn't hesitate. He pushed his infantry forward at pace and unleashed part of his cavalry reserve to run down what he assumed were fleeing militia, trying to turn a withdrawal into a massacre before the Americans could regroup. What he was actually looking at was Morgan's plan working exactly as designed. The British line surged forward into Howard's Continentals. The third line, the anchor, men who had not moved an inch and had no intention of running anywhere. The fighting here was close and brutal, muskets at 50 yards and closing, and for a few minutes, the outcome genuinely hung in the balance. Then Tarleton tried to win it outright. He ordered his reserve, a company of Scottish Highlanders from the 71st Regiment, to swing wide and hit the American right flank before Howard's line could reset. Howard saw it coming and gave an order to his own right flank company. Pivot backward, angle to face the new threat, a standard maneuver called refusing the flank. In the noise, smoke, and chaos of close combat, the order didn't travel cleanly. Instead of one company adjusting its angle, the whole American line began stepping backward in what looked, from the British side, exactly like the beginning of a collapse. For Tarleton and his exhausted, adrenaline-soaked soldiers, this was the moment they'd been chasing for weeks. The rebels were breaking, all of them. British discipline, already strained by the night march, and a fight that hadn't gone as fast as expected, gave way to something closer to a foot race. Men surging forward out of formation, desperate to close the distance and finish what looked like a beaten enemy before they could escape. They closed to roughly 30 yards. And that is when Howard, understanding instantly that his withdrawal had accidentally produced the perfect setup, gave the order that decided the battle: halt, turn, and fire. Nearly 500 Continental muskets went off almost simultaneously into a British formation that had lost its shape and closed to point-blank range. It wasn't a battle line anymore on the British side. It was a crowd, and the volley tore through it. Whole ranks went down at once. The survivors, seconds earlier convinced they were finishing off a broken enemy, suddenly found themselves staring at an American line that hadn't broken at all, reloading and leveling bayonets. Howard's Continentals didn't stop to reload a second time. They went in with bayonets while the British were still absorbing the shock of the volley. At almost the same moment, on the American right, William Washington's cavalry, held in complete secrecy behind the rise for the entire battle, broke cover and slammed into the exposed British right flank and rear. And on the left, Pickens' militia, the men everyone had assumed were finished for the day, had reformed exactly as planned during their staged withdrawal and now came storming back into the fight, hitting the British left flank at the precise moment Washington's cavalry hit the right. front collapsing under bayonets, right flank crushed by cavalry, left flank crushed by returning militia. In the span of roughly 10 minutes, Tarleton's force went from believing it was finishing a rout to being surrounded on 3 sides simultaneously with nowhere left to go. It is one of the only clean, complete double envelopments in American military history. The same shape of victory Hannibal achieved against Rome at Cannae nearly 2,000 years earlier, produced by a 51-year-old general who could barely sit a horse, using militia the entire British army had learned to expect nothing from. What followed wasn't really a battle anymore. It was a surrender in progress. Surrounded on 3 sides, with their front line broken and cavalry crashing into both flanks, most of Tarleton's infantry laid down their arms within minutes. Some tried to keep fighting. Most simply couldn't see a path out. The numbers, once the smoke cleared, were almost unbelievable for an 18th century engagement. Of roughly 1,100 British and Loyalist troops who marched onto that field, historians estimate around 110 were killed, more than 200 wounded, and over 500 captured outright, meaning close to 90% of Tarleton's entire force was killed, wounded, or taken prisoner in under an hour of actual fighting. Morgan's losses, by comparison, were remarkably light, roughly 12 killed and 60 wounded out of an army that had stood its ground against Britain's most feared strike force and won decisively. Tarleton himself barely escaped. As his army collapsed around him, he personally led a small remnant of dragoons in a last attempt to save his 2 artillery pieces and cut his way out, running directly into William Washington's cavalry in the process. The 2 commanders reportedly exchanged saber blows in the chaos of the retreat, at close enough range for Tarleton to wound Washington's hand before finally breaking off and riding clear of the field with what was left of his cavalry. Everything else, his infantry, his artillery, his reputation for invincibility, stayed behind. The consequences reached far beyond. One pasture in South Carolina. Tarleton's legion had been Cornwallis's fastest, most mobile strike force, the troops he depended on for reconnaissance, pursuit, and rapid response. Losing them in a single morning crippled his ability to campaign effectively across the Carolinas. Enraged and determined to salvage the Southern campaign, Cornwallis abandoned his own supply lines and launched an exhausting pursuit of the combined American army under Nathaniel Greene, a chase through the Carolina backcountry that became known as the Race to the Dan. It ended in a costly, technically won British victory at Guilford Courthouse 2 months later, a battle so bloody that a member of the British Parliament reportedly remarked that one more such victory would ruin the army entirely. Cornwallis retreated to Virginia to regroup. He never fully recovered his southern strategy. By October of that same year, he had surrendered his army at Yorktown, and the war for American independence was effectively over. None of it, historians generally agree, would have unfolded the same way without Cowpens. The battle has been studied at West Point and military academies worldwide for over 2 centuries, usually held up as one of the cleanest examples of a double envelopment ever executed on American soil. A battle plan that turned a perceived weakness, unreliable militia, into the exact mechanism of victory. Morgan never fought another major battle after Cowpens. His sciatica finally forced him into retirement within months. He didn't need another win to secure his place in the story. He'd already delivered the one that mattered most. Today, the battlefield itself survives largely untouched, preserved as Cowpens National Battlefield in Spartanburg County, South Carolina. You can walk the same open pasture where a teenage militiaman once stood in the dark, waiting for an order to fire twice and run. And see, marked along a quiet walking trail, the approximate spot where William Washington and Banastre Tarleton crossed sabers in the last chaotic minutes of a British army's destruction. Every great commander eventually meets a version of Morgan's problem. How do you win with the army you actually have, not the one you wish you had? Tarleton spent his whole career punishing hesitation. At Cowpens, the man who never paused finally ran headfirst into the one general patient enough to make hesitation someone else's mistake to make. If this kind of tactical breakdown is your thing, make sure you subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Drop a comment if you were commanding untested militia against a numerically similar but more experienced enemy. Would you trust them with a real battle plan like Morgan did, or keep them out of the front line entirely? We have a lot more battles to cover, and the stakes only get higher from here.